Hi, all. Jesus asked a question of his disciples that must have struck them like a thunderbolt. He asked them, "Who do you say I am?" Jesus was calling for personal commitment and decision. He was challenging his disciples to declare their understanding of his self revelation in word and deed. And the disciples knew the way they responded to Jesus would define the kind of disciples they were. Jesus' question was intended to set them apart from the multitudes who had followed Jesus for all the wrong reasons. And it is the same question that confronts every person today. It's a question that defines and divides. And since your answer determines your eternal future, it is the question of ultimate importance. And it is this question that this pandemic forces upon us when we are looking for a basis for hope and security. Certainly, this question must have been embedded in Peter's mind because you can almost hear its echoes as he writes the following words in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 4 to verse 8. And these verses describe the two basic responses to Jesus' question, "Who do you say I am?" Peter says, "And coming to him as a living stone, which has been rejected by men, but is choice and precious in the sight of God, you also, as living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For this is contained in Scripture. Behold, I lay in Zion a choice stone, a precious cornerstone, and he who believes in him will not be disappointed. This precious value then is for you who believe, but for those who disbelieve, the stone which the builders rejected, this became the very cornerstone, and a stone of stumbling, and a rock of offense. For they stumble because they are disobedient to the word, and to this doom they were also appointed." Peter writes to people who had come to the same conclusion about Jesus that he had, that Jesus was the Son of the living God, the Messiah promised by God, who gave his life on the cross as a ransom for many, and who rose again from the dead after 3 days. Peter writes to encourage them to remain faithful to Jesus Christ in the face of the painful opposition and abuse they were experiencing because of their adherence to Christ. A lot had changed since the day Jesus had confronted them with that question. His disciples had seen Jesus die on the cross, rise on the third day, and spend time with him for 40 days prior to his ascension. They had experienced Pentecost and had continued to bear witness to the facts of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection since that day, even at great personal cost. Peter himself was no longer the brash and cocky upstart who dared to tell Jesus that he would never deny him. Peter now understood Jesus' mission and purpose more fully. Years of experience in the gospel ministry had mellowed and matured him. But his resolve to bear witness to Jesus' person and work was undiminished, because it was the commission given him and his fellow disciples by the crucified and risen Lord, whom he confessed to be the Son of God. It is no wonder then that Peter is not ashamed to acknowledge that Jesus was rejected by men. After all, no one could deny that the Jews themselves had demanded the crucifixion of their Messiah. But Peter is all too conscious that though men might have rejected Jesus, as far as God was concerned, Jesus is choice and precious. And that's why he rose again. Jesus' resurrection was God's declaration to all and sundry that Jesus was indeed the Son of God and the promised Messiah. His crucifixion as a traitor and blasphemer was a travesty of justice. And so God reversed the sentence passed by the Sanhedrin and by Pilate by raising Jesus from the dead. Peter also points out that the rejection of Jesus should come as no surprise, for that was prophesied in Scripture hundreds of years before Jesus was born. Jesus' death and resurrection were all part of God's plan and purpose. It was through his sacrifice on the cross that he purchased the salvation of his people by satisfying God's justice and appeasing his wrath. By his death and resurrection, Jesus has given his people new life, so that through him we may have the privilege of worshiping and serving God acceptably. Now, in case the logic of Peter's argument escapes you, he encourages his suffering brethren by implicitly reminding them that their lives are shaped by the reality that their master had suffered the rejection of men, and so they must not be surprised if they are treated the same way. Jesus himself had warned them of this possibility. In fact, his response to their acknowledgement of his identity as the Messiah and Son of God was to tell them that it was necessary for him to be rejected, crucified, and resurrected. So if they wanted to be his disciples, they must deny themselves, take up their cross daily, and follow him. In other words, their suffering for Jesus was not a sign of defeat. It was part of God's master plan, in the same way that Jesus' defeat was no defeat, but rather the means of his ultimate victory. Moreover, they were to recognize that the persecution they endured was a continuing manifestation of man's rejection of Jesus. In the same way that the Jews' rejection of Jesus did not change his true value and worth in God's eyes, so the persecution believers suffer do not change the preciousness of Jesus. We are to continue to remind ourselves of the preciousness of Jesus because, as Peter points out from Scripture, he who believes in him will not be disappointed. And this is the same comfort and encouragement that we who have trusted in Jesus Christ need to hear in this day and age. Then, as now, the Jesus we proclaim, if we are faithful to the biblical message, is an unpopular and unacceptable Jesus. The offense of the cross is just as strong today as it was in Peter's time, even if the hostility is more subtle and its expression more sophisticated. We still need to fortify our spirits with the reality of Jesus' person and worth, understood only by faith enabled by the Spirit, reminding ourselves of the all-surpassing greatness of knowing Christ. We need to assure ourselves that because his death and resurrection have procured for us an eternal hope, we will not be disappointed. Our faith in him will one day be vindicated. And in these times when people are losing hope because the things in which they trust are being exposed as unreliable, Jesus remains the only hope who could give us real hope. He who believes in him will not be disappointed. And friends, it is our privilege to lead people to hope in Jesus.